so much for having me. Well, first of all, thanks a lot to Matt and to Robin and everyone at MESS. It's been fantastic coming down and spending, doing a bit of a deep dive on the Serge Paperface, which has been amazing. As Matt mentioned earlier this year, I got to spend a little bit of time on the Serge and kind of feeling my way, I guess, and it really whet my appetite to spend some more time on it. It was quite a bamboozling system the first time that I spent time with it. But now I feel like I've kind of got to grips with what it's capable of, but I still feel like I'm kind of scratching the surface of all of the sounds and movements that are possible with it. So look, just background on me. I work at the Sydney Conservatorium, so I'm an electronic musician, academic there. And I've been making electronic music probably for the last 15 years or something like that. My background's as a saxophone player, classically trained saxophone player. And I started getting into electronic music through programming, actually. So through working with Max MSP, doing interactive stuff, live improvisation stuff with saxophone, that kind of thing. And I fell head deep into the world of modular synthesis probably about 3 years ago. I brought a little my mother, and it was fantastic. And then I soon after found myself in Melbourne and came here, and then my bank balance has gone. So I've got a Eurorack system at home. My Eurorack system is constantly changing, but I'm constantly kind of looking for things that can challenge me and can allow me to kind of find things in the machine that I don't really expect when I come to it every day. And anyone that has worked with a modular synthesizer probably knows that feeling. So the Serge has been fantastic just to spend this kind of concentrated time on it because I'm getting that feeling every single day. It's a process of discovery, which has been really awesome. So the structure of the presentation, basically what I thought I'd start with is to do a little bit of a performance. I've got a patch set up here which is quite different to some of the stuff that I've been doing this week because this week I'm trying to generate as much material as possible so that I can put out a release at some point with all of this material. So that mode of working is quite different to prepping a performance patch. So I'll do a little performance and then I might just run through what the sound sources are and how I'm working with this patch and show you maybe some examples of the stuff I've been recording this week, and then I'll pull the patch cables and we'll do a bit of a deep dive into what's going on, how the Serge works, sound sources, modulation, etc. But maybe I'll ask David actually if you wanted to give a bit of a historical context of where this all comes from.
Thanks.
That's right.
Hi. Yeah, so I guess it's just worth saying, I was thinking about what I might say, and one of the things was, way back when I started working on this, it was a long, long time ago, and this, I guess it was approached in a different way that I imagine it as things are approached now, because there was very little history to like electronic music. There was a history that you were taught, but there wasn't one that was accessible. You couldn't kind of download and hear what other people were doing with things. And the other thing is, we were kind of still within the sort of modernist sort of attitude to making work, which was this thing of like powering ahead. And there was kind of like you didn't really pay super attention to what had previously happened. It was more about devising things for the future and making your kind of sort of architectural sort of inventions in a way. Whereas what I feel now is there's this weight of that people have to work with, of the history of electronic music, and people have got access to both the philosophies and the kinds of sounds that were being made. So it's mine was, I guess, more of an innocent sort of activity, and a lot of the works that I did were generational, that made patches that self-played. That's because there was this interest back then in this sort of latter-day modernism, though I like to say we were the postmodernists, but there was still this interest in internal structure, and so like relationships of pitches to each other and structures that would play out internally. Whereas I think post the digital kind of deluge that we got in the sort of 90s and forever, there became this real interest in timbre and this, making new sounds and just discovering sounds and listening to sounds for their own sake, sounds in the sound in itself, and all of this kind of listening to the impactfulness of the synthesizer. But we were more into just using it as a tool to make internal structures, and often didn't really explore perhaps some of the more amazing timbral sort of possibilities. So I just thought they're the kind of things I'm just wanted to give that kind of perspective, and so that's why I'm kind of curious as to how these all these instruments get used now, where there's just so much knowledge and information and philosophies really in how you kind of work with these kinds of systems. So they're my comments. So I'm very curious to hear.
Thanks a lot. Cool. So here we go. I'm going to start basically just going through what that was, how I did it, the kinds of sounds and movements that were going on. I'll just basically maybe talk through each one of the voices that you heard and the sequencing and things, and then I'll pull the patch and have a listen to some other stuff. So, I mean, it was, you know, pretty repetitive melodic thing, kind of modal. Very different to what I've been doing this week, as you'll hear. But maybe what I'll do is just kind of start with what I was doing here with one of the sequences. Sorry, this is called a programmer. There's two programmers here. We'll learn about them in a minute. But basically, I was using this as two different things. I was using it first as a keyboard, so that I could kind of bring in sounds and actually play melodic lines with it. And then after I brought in a couple of different textures, I then started this negative slew here, which sends out a pulse which allows me to actually sequence the sequencer here. So, and then I brought in, I've got a couple of different CV sources going into this dual processor that allows me to either use the keys to control it or use the sequencer to control it. So what I really like about this system is how much mixing there is, both of audio sources and also CV. And it just makes it really, really flexible for doing live performance, but also for creating these kinds of generative things that David was talking about before. So what I'll do is I'm just going to tweak an envelope here so I can go back to that first sound. Here's the first sound. There we go. And so what I've got here is I've got each one of these pulse outputs here sends out a pulse that I'm sending to an envelope, and that envelope will bring in the oscillator that I've got tuned to each one of these pitches. So I think I'm using this second row here, meticulously tuned. It's quite difficult to tune this thing and to keep it in tune. Trying to tune oscillators and have multiple parts at one time can be a bit of a challenge, but you can do it. So if I were to play, say, the tonic here, I'm going through a couple of different effects in Ableton. So one's a convolution reverb of a spring reverb I've got at home, a dual spring reverb, and then the other one is just a delay. So there's just a little bit of processing going on. And then as that rises, once I'm at the top, if I maintain that pulse out, I don't have a drop in the voltage, and I can keep the sound there. So that's what you saw me doing as I got up to top voltage. And then I've got what we call a negative slew, which is the downward part of the envelope, which I'm keeping stable, so that when I bring in the sequencer, which is what I did, then as I scale its voltage, something's happening here. As with a lot of modular systems, there's a fantastic capability to be able to reset the sequencer, and so I'm doing that using a sample and hold, so that every now and again I'm stopping the sequence and bringing it back to one, and I can kind of scale how much of that goes on. So if I were to bring that back in, sequencer programmer combos in the Serge, that we have the sequencer here, which is sending out our pulses or our kind of gate outputs, we were to get just an 8-step sequence, instead of resetting it using some sample and hold, you choose step 9, and then that resets it, right? So if I want a 7-step sequence, I'll go to 8. Yeah. So that's that voice. There's another voice that I've got going on there. I might just turn that down. Another voice that I've got going on there, which is, there we go, which is the bass, and that's I'm using this massive sequencer over here, this sequencer as a clock divider. So I mean, for any of you that have Eurorack systems or modular systems, you'll know that clock dividers are usually quite small things. So I have this here, and I don't have a dedicated clock divider, so I'm using this one as a clock divider. So what that means is that basically as it hits number 3, I'm triggering a bass sequence, which is going through, and I've got that as a 4-step sequence. So as we go through, notice that the sequencer itself, this program here, is moving through the pitches at a different rate to how we're actually hearing the sequence. So that's because I've got my envelope is being triggered by something else. So I like this kind of interesting balance between things that are predictable, so constant sequences, and injecting a little bit of randomness so that each time the envelope triggers, it'll be on a different note, so it's not always exactly the same. So that's with the two of them together, you get something that's tuned. Now this is going in 7 steps. Cool. And so each one of these are using the main oscillators, and we'll get to that in a second. Another one, I've actually got some stereo panning, and we'll talk about how you can do that on the Serge. So I've got 2 sources going into some stereo panning. One is white noise through one of the Serge beautiful bandpass filters. So we've got a few filters over here. I'm taking some white noise, and then I'm sending that through. And the filter cutoff is tuned to the tonic of the sequence, so that it sounds in tune. A little bit of reverb delay, because why not? Okay. And then I've got another mixer over here I can bring in, instead of the white noise, I can bring in, where's the knob? I can bring in this. So that click, what I'm sending into the filter is actually 2 things. I've got white noise being sent into the filter, so that's that first sound that you heard, but then I've just got a clock pulse sending a ping to the filter into its main input, and that's what gives you that lovely pretty classic Serge sound of kind of pinging one of these really, really resonant filters. So if I were to decrease the resonance, you get that. Doesn't sound like a pitch anymore. So that kind of really classic glassy sounding pinging sound. So that's that sound. There's one more sound, I believe. Yeah, one more sound, which is that. I'll go through how I made this sound, but this is the triple wave shaper here. So this is a wave shaping module that allows you to turn, it says in the manual, it allows you to turn a sawtooth wave into a sine wave. It's not quite that, but you can do some really amazing things with it. So the triple wave shaper, it's 3 identical modules that aren't normal together, but you can patch one into the other and then another into another, and then you can get these really interesting shaped timbres with it. But I have one of these in Eurorack at home, the random source version of this, the triple wave shaper module. And I was experimenting one day, and I found that if you patched the outputs back into the inputs and the outputs back into the inputs, you can get some really interesting feedback with it. And that's what this sound is here. invasive, but lots and lots of fun. So the reason why it's changing kind of pseudo in time with the sequence is that I'm sending in a voltage control, a CV from the same sequencer that I'm running everything else off. And so that means that although it's coming from a different row, which means they're different voltages, it's still in time with the sequence. So it'll go from not feeding back to feeding back, and you have this kind of really bassy, clicky sound, which I didn't realise was so bassy until we plugged the sub in actually. But that's a lot of fun. So yeah, so they're the sound sources. That's how I kind of worked things through with this. I'm going to unpatch now, so it might take a minute or so, and then we're going to have a bit of a deep dive into how we can actually make this thing work for you. Before I do that, I'll play a couple of examples of things that I've done through the week. So maybe talk amongst yourselves as I unpatch the beast. So what I might do is I might just show you a few little things. I'm not going to talk too much about them, just to show you the variety of the sounds that the Serge can make, and then we'll make some of them ourselves. So I might just start with something quite different, using a kind of similar technique, pinged filters, but also using some of these kind of noisy timbres. So if I go and find that, this one here. So that's a couple of tracks overlaid on top of each other. There's these kind of granular clicks, which are the pinged filters, plus this triple wave shaper feedback. And I was using a couple of different stereo panning things going on, and then just recorded them in a couple of passes. Something quite different, just to show you the low end and the kind of the purity of the system if you kind of tweak things correctly. Here's some low bass. And then something using all of these kinds of ideas at once. And find this. So this was recorded live. Taste. So the high-pitched stuff is FM to really high, so frequency modulated really high oscillators, and again the triple wave shaper for some of the feedback sounds. low bass, a similar process with the low pass filter, and then a pinged filter into a bit of a delay. Something really different. I really like this sound, as you would have guessed already, of the resonance in these filters. So I was playing around with something that was using the pinged filters, but as I was recording it, I realized as you really crank the resonance, not only do you get this kind of pinging tone, but you also get a bit of a whistle out of it, and it was faint in the background. So I thought, well, look, why don't I just put in some white noise and really bring that whistle out. So this is the kind of sound. Three different tones. So something that uses the filter in quite a different way. I'm also using some phasing, and also, because we have a phaser module over here, and where's the phaser? There's the phaser, and also some kind of pulse width modulation on a square wave. What I like doing quite a bit is layering sounds. So we've got, in that particular track, there are 4 tracks. So I've got one that's stereo panning and then 2 separate. So if I just isolate them for you, just to show you how in my sound design, how I start to stack things. Here's one of them. Source, but taking different outputs, and when you put them together, and I'll probably just show one more thing before we start going on some stuff. So here's just a couple more. I was playing with FM. This is on the very first day, playing with a lot of FM and kind of and working with interesting rhythmic changes using the sequences and kind of feeding the sequences back into what the clock that was driving it to get these kind of interesting rhythmic effects. So this kind of thing. Bit of a robot jam. Cool, so yeah, so there's some of the sounds I've made. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do with them yet, but time will tell. So, cool, so are we all good? Do we need a break or anything like that? How long have we been going for, by the way? Just so I know.
I think we're right. Anyone want to drink? Yeah.
It's 10 to 6. Okay, cool.
10 to 6.
All right. So let's make some sound on the stage. Okay, so first what I want to talk about is the layout and the architecture of the system, how everything's laid out and how you can make use of it. So as you can see, we've got each one of them, we have 12 panels in the Serge. So each one of the panels is laid out slightly differently, but we have kind of a method in the madness, a bit of bit of logic going on. I don't think that when it was originally set up, it was in this configuration.
No, it's slightly different.
It was slightly different, yeah.
The same modules, but
Yeah, definitely.
it's different. It just looks different.
Yeah, yeah. So what we've got, first I'll start with these panels here. So we've got the sequencer here, which is this module, and then we've got 2 programmers, and they work together. And then we've got 4 of these, but the last 2 are slightly different because instead of having a couple of negative slews, which are generally used in this case to drive the sequencer, they've been taken off, and we've got these bidirectional routers here that allow you to kind of flip between one input and another, or the other way around, one output and another. And so these 2 are identical. Some of the modules, some of the little elements in the modules in the system, only a few don't work. So just kind of navigating around. But when you're using the system, you'll notice that anything that's got a little purple dot is something there's a bit of a problem with it. And Ken Stone, who I think owns this system, or I mean, it's,
Yeah, I guess Ken's been the caretaker and it's
right.
passed it on to us.
Yeah,
It's
he's got, there's a little folder there that's got 2 pages. One gives a little bit of a history, and the second one tells you all the things that are wrong. And he's got stickers in there, so if you find anything wrong, you can put your own sticker on it. But maybe check with Matt or anyone before you do that.
Well, just to say a little
Yeah.
anecdote, when it first arrived, all of the back of it was sealed off, and all of the electronics had these black gooey globs on them, and so no one can get access.
Wow.
Because apparently we were told, they've just landed on the moon, and this is the technology, and it's so it's only just come into the hands of the counterculture, you might say.
Yeah.
And so it was all impenetrable. It was
Right.
really hard to know what was going on.
Right,
So
interesting.
I think Ken might have had to dealt with
Yeah,
that.
yeah, right, yeah, just to kind of open it up so people can work with it properly. Yeah, interesting.
There's a few videos of this actual system when he was restoring it in different different cases where he was just kind of separated it off as he was testing it. And it's really amazing to see it really stripped back into just individual panels.
Yeah, I have to. Would you be able to send me a link?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can circulate that
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, great. So each one of these, they have, as I mentioned, so you've got the sequencer and program combo, and we'll go through how you work with those in a minute. And then the next thing I wanted to talk about was these guys over here. So we have 3 identical panels over here. This is your oscillators. So each one has 2 oscillators in them. You've got 2 VCAs called a gate. And then you've got your 2 filters, which you've got low band and high pass. And then in each one of these panels, you've also got 2 envelope generators here as well. So these 3 panels are identical. So that's, although as you'll see in the Serge, pretty much everything can be a sound source, you kind of think of this area as your main kind of sound sources, I guess. Then into over here, I'm jumping around a little bit just because of the workflow of it, but this is, you'll notice I've kept a few cables in here. This I tend to think of as kind of the routing, outputs, and kind of processing section. So you've got, what I really like about this machine is that you've got tons of mixing. You've got these mixers here, which you've got 3 inputs, 2 outputs, and gain knobs for each one, but you've also got another input which is called X1. Has anyone used the Make Noise Optimix before at all? Yeah. So I think this is where that idea came from. So you've got a few different inputs, although it's not a VCA or an LPG, but you've got this auxiliary input as well. So you can do these kind of sub-mixes. So you can mix 3, send 1 out, mix another couple, send 1 out. So it makes it really flexible for mixing. And then you've got all these mixers over here, and they're conveniently placed next to these outputs. So you'll notice that I've got these little 3.5 jacks. I've got 6 of them so that I can do multi-track recording for mixing later. So I highly recommend that when you're working on a system like this, which is so extensible. There's interfaces I think that MES provides, but if you bring your own interface, there's plenty of these cables around. If you've got the facility and you've got the storage space, you might as well multi-track, because there may be something you record in stereo that it's really difficult to change later on. So that's how I like to work with it. And then there's a few other modules that I'll go through in a minute. So the last thing is, in terms of the architecture, is this section here. And so I kind of call this is your modulation area, as well as CV processing in general. So your processing of your control voltages. So what we've got in this area, we've got two really quite special smooth and stepped function generators. So they're your kind of sample and hold area. We've got a peak and trough module, which allows you to put in four inputs in each, and then it will spit out whatever the highest value is, which can be super useful for doing interesting modulation. And then we've got noise generator here, which also has a sample and hold source. It's been fantastic playing around with this system, because often I'll spend time on a module and then I'll plug something in and I'll go, oh, I recognize that sound, or I recognize that process. And this one, the sample and hold source, really reminds me of the woggle output from the Make Noises woggle block, which is this really complex, very chaotic sound source, rather than just a control voltage. So that's put in here with the noise source, and then a couple of random generators, which is great for doing sample and hold and interesting modulation. And then we've got these positive slews here. I'll talk about the slews in just a minute, but these positive slews are your kind of ramps. They can also be a sound source, which is great. And these 12 here, I was doing a little bit of reading, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, David, but on Ken Stone's site, he talks a little bit about this glide, and I don't think that actually exists in any other Serge system of the time, or maybe even now. The glide is basically a slew which doesn't have a lot of extra control. When it's right up here, it's fast, and we've got little to no glide, and when it's down here, it slews your control voltage. And there's 12 of them, which seems like a lot, but when you think about it, we've got 4 sequences, each one of them's got 3 outputs, and so we've got 12 different CV sources that we can kind of glide up and down. So that's the architecture of the system, and maybe we should make some sound. So what I've got is, I've got a couple of outputs, so I'm going to use these as my main mixers. Later on I'll do a little bit of stereo panning, but not heaps. So let's start with an oscillator. So I've got these oscillators over here. Just going to take its wave shape output, which is the top one here, and I'm going to keep it at its sine wave setting, which is not quite a sine wave. Decent range, and because I'm coming out the wave shape output, you've also got a pot here which controls your wave shape, and so that goes from a sine wave to a sawtooth. I've got an amazing range, which is awesome. Each one of them is calibrated slightly differently, so the point on the pot where one frequency isn't exactly the same, but you've got to use your judgment and play around with it, which is fun. So that's the oscillator. Did I turn that down? Okay. You've got these wave shape outputs here, but you've also got dedicated sawtooth outputs as well. And each one of them has 2 possible control voltage inputs. So if I were to do something super simple, take another cable. I'm just going to do this manually. So I've got this sequence up here. I'm going to place it into the control voltage input. It's an attenuator, so it can go positive or negative. So if I put it in positive, then as these knobs go clockwise, then it should raise the pitch. So I'm on the 4th stage. These particular pots here kind of cut out at about, I think about 10 o'clock, some of them. So finding out these little chord okay, so we can do that, but of course it's a control voltage input, but also can be sent. You can also send an audio source, right? So that you can do some FM. So if I were to just monitor out the same output, oh no, hang on. I'll just take another oscillator here, which is right next to it. So you've got 2, 2, and 2. And I want to whack that in this input here. That's what's going to be my modulator frequency. So I turn it off. So instead of placing that into the mixer, I'm going to place that into my oscillator. I'm going to turn down the modulation. So I'm just going to change the pitch of the original, the carrier. As I increase the depth of modulation. Get pretty gnarly pretty fast, which is really nice. So you'll see there I'm actually using both of the attenuators, the inputs for control voltage. So one of them is the pitch in terms of these voltages here, and then the other one was the FM input. Yeah. So lots of stuff to be done with that. So there are our main oscillators. The thing I wanted to show you next is that a Serge concept that gets talked about a lot is patch programmability. So has anyone heard of this term before in terms of Serge? So what Serge talks about in terms of his systems, what he really wanted to express was that each one of these functions can really be thought of as multiple things. So something that might be thought of as an envelope generator that you can shape your filter with or you can shape your amplitude with can also be an oscillator. And it can, something that might be an oscillator can also be something else. So I've just shown you the oscillators, and there's 6, and you can do really well with just using those as oscillators, awesome. But these negative slews and these positive slews, as well as the envelope generators, can also be oscillators or sound sources, which is super useful. So if I show you that, I want to talk a little bit about the positive and negative slew, because these ones are a really big part of the system. So a negative slew is basically a ramp wave that goes from positive down to negative. So it goes from 5 volts down to 0. So not negative, but goes from 5 volts down to 0. And you can cycle them. So these ones up here, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 negative slews in the system. And you'll see this little light here. I was using that to clock my sequence up. But you'll notice as I go up, it also goes into audio land. Right? So generally people would think of this as something that you would use to clock things, or maybe an envelope, but you can use it as a nice kind of sawtooth waveform. So if I take that one out and then pop it into the same mixer that I was working on before. So it has quite a range, which is really nice. And so for something that, you know, at first sight you might think of as being an envelope, the range and rate of each one of these is organized so that you can use them as anything, really, which is super awesome. Okay, that's enough. Now the positive slews is the inverse. All right, so instead of going from 5 volts down, you go from 0 volts up. The slews, I'll show you that you can use them in different ways as well. But basically, the positive slews, you've got 2 here and 2 here, and I believe that's it for the positive slew. But basically, instead of having a switch here, what you do to organise a positive slew to cycle as an oscillator is that you need to patch it. So this is this concept of patch programmability. So you need to decide what the function of the module is going to be. And it's really easy. So what we've got here is I've got the end pulse gate of my positive slew, and I put it into this input here, which is called start. All right? So that means that the gate at the end, and you'll see that rising there now, the gate at the end, as soon as that hits positive, it'll start the envelope again. And so then you just get this self-cycling thing. So often in my patches I had multiple of these kind of fed back into each other. It's just the same as flicking a switch here. This is just normal, so that it's easy to work with. So that's that, so we have listened to that one. So we've got basically that sawtooth wave, that ramp wave, but inversed, yeah? So I'll take its output. The outputs are the white ones here. And listen. So again, really hot signal and a really wide range, which is super awesome. So you could, for instance, do what we did before, which was take an audio source to frequency modulate an oscillator, right? So I could take that, instead of taking it from an oscillator, if I'm using all of these for something else, although I don't think I had a patch where I used all 6 oscillators, I have something available for me, which is awesome. And take this guy. These banana cables, by the way, for anyone that's never used a banana cable, they're stackable, which is great, and they feel really sturdy, which is awesome. So basically what I've got here is I've got this one as its output, and then I'm taking an output and I can feed that somewhere else, right? Often in Serge patches, and some booklet ones as well, you notice that a lot of people kind of stack way up, but maybe only a couple, I think. So we've got this one here. So super useful as a modulation source, both in at audio rate and not at audio rate. So that's that. Let's get to the pretty simple stuff. In terms of sound sources, just so that you can hear them, we've got white noise up here, pink noise, which is your low pass filter, and then, if you're so inclined, sampling hold source, which is kind of an interesting one. Mainly there, I think, so that you can whack that, because of the name, you can whack that into a sample and hold, and you've got a lot of voltage, so you can grab a lot of stuff out.
How does it relate to the white noise, that one? Is it like a...
I'm not sure exactly. I think possibly you don't actually have any rate controls over these ones. This bottom one actually I'll show you as well. No, I'll show you that in a second. I'm not sure. It sounds like a digital noise, that it's being clocked at a different rate to the actual to the white noise itself, and so it's giving you that kind of warbling sound. And this one I haven't actually used as a sound source, and this one sounds quite different down here. It's the same thing, but that's the same source as up here. But it's just a different sound. Yeah. So often you'll find in this system that things that are named the same, they have slightly different characteristics, which makes it a lot of fun actually, because it's never as you expect it. Cool, so that's that for the basic sound sources. I want to show you this pinging filter thing, So here are your filters. One thing to note with the filters is that, and same with a few of the other modules that I've already mentioned, with the filter generally with resonance, when you're cranking the resonance, you're going clockwise, right? So you're increasing the resonance. I don't know why, but for some reason it's the opposite. So a lot of the things that we kind of take for granted that we know from our systems are just programmed another way, or built another way. So if I were to take this one here, so as we remember that's the negative slew, that's its ramp output, but it's also got a pulse output, right? So at the end of the stage. So I can actually use that one. Anything that's red is a pulse output. I can use that one and I can put it into the input of my filter. And I'll show you the different outputs, but I like the bandpass output for pinged filters because it has this really nice resonance to it. And your frequency control is down here. So I've got no resonance at the moment, so it should just sound like a click. But as you increase and decrease the frequency, you can hear that filter and its frequency. So if I wanted to do something that was like a bass drum type sound, it's pretty deep. Okay. So that's just the filter ringing out. Yeah. We'll get to talking about feedback in a minute, but I find that you can increase that resonance by feeding it back into itself as well. All right, so you can get these kind of really long resonances, and also just pure sine tones as well. So if I were to do the low pass output, actually for a bass drum sound, it's probably better. Didn't realise that. Because you get less of the click and then up high, of course. Okay. Cool. So that's that. Now.
Ben, just
Yeah.
have you explored like so the idea of like pinging filters, like outside of using low pass gates and more of that, like within like from Ookla and that make noise kind of low pass gate kind of idea. Have you explored lots of different filters, like plucking lots of different filters, just standard like multi-mode filters? In that kind of resonance, it's really beautiful.
It's really beautiful. Yeah. I mean, I guess. The filters that I've got in my rack at home are actually the random source version of this, so the VCF-Q. But I've also got Three Sisters, which also has amazing resonance.
Yeah.
But I haven't tried with other filters, and definitely I've pinged those ones. I mean, actually, the random source version of this, which is a later recreation of the Serge, actually has a dedicated trig input because he knew that everyone was using it for that. So. You can have a trig input and then have another sound going in as well. But I haven't tried. I should. Yeah. I guess anything with a high enough resonance should.
Yeah.
I mean, technically, I'm not sure, but yeah. Yeah, and then of course as well, if you wanted to take that up higher, where is that output? I find that because the tail of the sound is very purer than the sine tones that are actually in the oscillators. I find that doing FM on the filters is actually a really nice technique. So if I were to take an oscillator here, and I put it into the CV input of the filter, that's like a classic kind of booklery Serge sound, yeah. Sequencer. I'll talk about this in a minute. So this is where mixers come in handy. You've only got one CV input. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to mix, just see how this works. I'm going to mix my FM source into this dual voltage processor over here, which allows me to mix a couple of different voltages, and you can put audio into it as well, I think. We'll find out. And so now I've got my FM source, which is there. But then I'll also take my sequencer. That kind of thing, yeah. So, I mean, whilst I'm here, I might as well get to it. So I did mention these mixers here. These are generally optimized to be audio mixers, right? So you have multiple sources and you send them to the one place. Whereas these dual processors are optimized to be things where you can mix CD, yeah? And so I was using that as kind of best of both worlds. So I had an audio source going into the dual processor, and I'm adding it. You have positive and negative, and then I've got my CV source, which is the sequencer, also going in. Yeah. So there's plenty of things that you can do, and we have two dual processors, which means that you've got 4 processors in there, which makes it really flexible.
Is there an offset?
There is an offset as well, yeah. So if I were to, that's your offset, yeah. And I believe it's just a positive offset. Yeah. Which means you can actually use the offset just as a stand-in for a frequency knob. So yeah, that makes it flexible. So that's the pinging filter. I think I've probably shown you enough of the feedback in the triple wave shaper, because you heard that in the live performance, but also in the recording. So I won't get to that. But what I might do now is just talk a little bit about the sequencer section. So we've already kind of touched on this, and maybe we'll use this sound as our main source. Here we go. Okay, so as I mentioned before, what I really like about working with this old system is that I'm seeing the lineage of ideas that are making their way into your app modules from this kind of Serge system. So this sequencer here, if anyone's used a Make Noise pressure points before, it basically looks like an identical copy except for the pressure outputs. So you've got 3 rows of voltages, and you've got an output for each, which means that you can sequence through these 2 programmers here and have 3 CV sources going to different places. That could be the 3 oscillators, or 1 to a filter, and maybe 1 to the rate of the thing that's clocking it, that kind of thing, to get interesting rhythms. But the sequencer here is tied to, I might use this one actually for now. The sequencer here is actually tied to the, where are we? It's actually tied to the programmers, but on this one on the left, originally when they were made, they didn't have any normalization in the back of them. So what that meant is that if you wanted to link this one with that one, then each one of these pulse outputs, pulse 1, pulse 2, pulse 3, pulse 4, would have to go into the sequencer, the programmer inputs that you wanted. And of course you can still use it that way if you like, but I'm just going to show you with this one because you can turn on and off that normalization because there's a switch here, which allows you to do that. So if I just run another, there we go. Oh, wrong one. Okay. So what I need to do to start the sequencer running is I need to take a pulse output from my negative slew. so you can see, as I mentioned before, there are 10 steps in the sequencer, but 8 steps in the programmer. So if you have a look, it'll stay on 10 for a couple of extra ones. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it an 8-step sequence. That means you choose output 9, which is one past the number of sequences you've got, and you whack that into the reset. So now it's going through the way that you would expect. And let's take this. But then you can stop any stage whenever you want using the push buttons. Yeah. And what I learned just this morning is that these two outputs up the top, I was trying to patch them earlier in the week because I thought, well, you've got these pulse outputs for each one of the stages, right? I thought these must be for all of them, right? So a pulse output for every step. In fact, that's not the case. The pulse output is only happens, if I were to take that out, pulse output only happens when you press. Whoa, sorry guys, I didn't realise it was going to be that hot. So what that's doing is just readdressing the stages, but also sending out an extra trigger. Yeah. Which is why I could use this when you saw me do that little performance, both as something that I could use to trigger an envelope, and then when I turned on the sequencer, I could also take a negative slew pulse output to actually trigger. Right? So you can use both of these things. So these ones won't come out unless you press a key. Yeah. But I think that's actually brilliantly organised, so that you can use that only when you need to do something that's quite physical and
So the triggers then the buttons are actually fire off independently of what the sequence is doing. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. So those outputs there are directly connected to only
just the button.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it mixes them all together, right?
Yeah.
So all of these come out.
Yeah.
There. Yeah.
It's a beautiful second layer of functionality to this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's what I wanted something when I was organising a little performance. It's like I wanted something that was tactile. And earlier in the week, I'd played around with the buttons, but I didn't realise that they could also be used for envelopes. Talking of envelopes, let's get to doing some enveloping. There's a few different ways of doing, just like many things on the Serge, a few different ways of doing envelopes using the Serge. And so the obvious one is the one called envelope generator. And when I spent time here earlier this year on my first couple of sessions on the Serge, I tried them because I thought, all right, it's an attack and release on the envelope generator. Okay, great, I'm going to have a snappy attack and release, I'm going to use that. But they just didn't work for me. And I thought, oh, they're missing a purple dot. But they're not, I just didn't know what was going on. Importantly, just like I was mentioning before with this cue here, some of the positions of the knobs are different than you expect. Right, so in an envelope generator, generally as you increase, you're increasing the time of the stage, right? So an attack, as you go clockwise, you're increasing the time. But each one of them, think of anything that has time as an element that you're changing. Think of them like an oscillator. So time is frequency. So as we increase, we're actually increasing rate. Yeah. So I'll show you that now. What I'm going to do is we're going to do a little bit of kind of frequency sweeping. So I'm going to grab this oscillator. I'm going to do a pretty typical synthesis path. I'm going to go oscillator out to a filter. Filter into, so low pass filter, into a VCA. So remember I mentioned before these are called a gate, just so that you're not confused. You've got an AC input and a DC input. So generally anything with a black, you're putting in audio sources. I'm going to do that. So there's my input. I'm going to take out. The output at the top. I'm going to place it in my mixer. Turn that right up. And then you've got a kind of manual volume knob down the bottom. Right. Cool. And then, because I'm going into the low pass filter. So you've got two inputs for the gates. You've got a linear input and a log input. So I'm going to use first of all, I'm not going to use the envelope generator. I'm just going to stick with this negative slew for the moment, just to show you what it sounds like. I'm going to put that directly into the log input. So my offset is completely down. Put it into the log input. But I don't like to click at the start. So what I'm going to do, now this might get a little bit confusing, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to put this into a positive slew. All right, so we used a positive slew before, remember that's a ramp weight, right? We can use that as an oscillator, but it's a slew, which means it takes any voltage and it will slew that. So at its fastest rate, there's no slewing or little to no slewing. At its slowest rate, it slews and glides that over time. So the positive slew is what you're then going to, I'm changing its rate. I'm going to take the negative slew and put it into the positive slew. So you can see that my output here is down there. So now what we've created with the negative slew and the positive slew is what became known later on as the dual universal slope generator, which is a very famous Serge module, which has two of these positive and negative slews that are combined, and then it's the precursor to the very famous Make Noise Maths. So what we've got is, if I turn that up, you should hear less of an attack already. Actually, you don't hear any. Oh, because I haven't put the. Okay, so there's your positive slew output. Right, so negative slew output into positive slew. Positive slew output into a log input. I'll turn that up. As I put it in the wrong one. There we go. Okay. So even at its fastest setting, I've gotten rid of that click. Yeah. Okay. As I smooth it off though, there's something quite specific that happens with these, is that the voltage doesn't quite catch up. So it's all, because it's being slewed, it's all kind of staying, doesn't quite get to its full level, right? So as you decrease that, if you've got something coming in faster than the rate of the actual, of the positive slew, then you're going to get a reduction in level, yeah? But what I'll do is I'll just slow down the clock, right? And we get that nice exponential attack sound. Okay. And so let's now take the same, I'll stack this output for the positive slew. And I'm going to put this into my filter. So remember, I've got oscillator going into low pass filter. Alright. And now I'm going to do the typical thing where I take an envelope and now we get this really vocal sound. Or you instead of it going up first, it now goes down first, which is the opposite of the direction of the amplitude modulation, yeah, which is quite an interesting sound. And if I were to slow that down just to really hear the change in frequency. It's quite nice. So this is with the cue just above 12 o'clock, so actually I can get much more resonance out of that. You can hear it going in steps actually. If I were to take just the sawtooth output, it's even more raw. The sawtooth output, because it's not a wave shape between sine and saw, seems to be much hotter level. Seems to be a much brighter saw than the as you get towards the saw in the wave shape. Yeah. So that's a pretty standard way of using a positive and negative slew together. Yeah. I mean, obviously, if you didn't want this the negative slew triggering things, then what you could do is you could actually have this cycle upon itself. So you've just got the sawtooth itself, the up sawtooth, doing all the slewing. He says, where is that? Oh no, I did the wrong thing, sorry. Yes. So what I'll just show you now, because they're pretty easy to understand, is the, we might do that and then maybe we'll just check time, Matt, after this. So instead of using the positive slew, let's just use the standard envelope generator. So what we need with an envelope generator, there's two ways you can work with it. You can either use a trigger to start the envelope, or, so here's your attack and your release, or you can cycle it. Okay, so what are these? Okay, yeah. So what I've got now, here's the envelope generator output. And now to start it, there's a handily named input, which is called start. And I just take a pulse output. Okay, and so remember these guys are, rate is faster when it's that way. So if I want a snappy attack, oh, I've done it the wrong way around. So that's your attack. Sorry, I'm getting confused. And that's your release. Okay. Now, as with many of these modules, if the release time hasn't finished before it receives another trigger in, then it might not restart. Yeah. So you got to be kind of work with them gingerly. You can get quite a nice attack and decay. But as I get longer in terms of my release, so it doesn't take every pulse, right? It waits until the stage is finished. Okay. So that's your enveloping, right? And then because I'm clocking the sequencer using the negative slew, that's changing my envelope. And obviously I can. Oh, hang on, I did something really dumb. What did I do? Oh, that was really dumb. Sorry. Okay, so that's a pretty pretty standard subtractive synthesis type approach, right? So you've got something that's giving you the clock going into an envelope, that envelope going into both filter and your VCA or your gate, which has an offset as well, and then going out to the mixer. Cool. How are we going for time, Matt?
This one's 7:35.
Okay.
Want me to make a comment? Just a
Of
comment?
course, please do.
So yeah, it's interesting because when the envelopes which you just got to were actually the first thing that we were kind of Warren Burrs told who knows this system, which as he kind of taught me, but it was like it all came from the envelopes, and you can kind of chain them together in a way where using sort of sample and hold, you can kind of generate a whole lot of kind of frequencies and pitch classes, and from my point of view, it was at a time when I kind of steered clear of the sequences,
Right.
because back then it was like Tangerine Dream and a whole lot of, it was everyone had sequences. It was like so fucking boring.
Yeah.
So the whole thing was to avoid them, to
Insert
build it
sequences
up more
all the time.
organically from the other components. I mean, that was just then, you know.
Yeah, sure.
And so, if anything, the sequences were driven at audio rates and used to kind of sculpt sound and do frequency division, that kind of thing. Which locks in your kind of...
that's interesting. Yeah,
working just intonation.
Yeah. So, I mean, I found that interesting. It was Morgan that works here, actually, that mentioned that to me this week, that driving a sequencer at audio rate, you can get really interesting sounds in terms of, I might just show you that really briefly. You can get really interesting sounds using that as a sound source, and then moving each one of the pots, it then becomes a wave shape.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is really awesome. So I've been driving things in a pretty standard way, but if I were to grab an actual oscillator, there we go. Hang on a second. What do I need for that? There we go. As you mentioned, then this reset thing becomes a way of doing frequency division, right? Okay.
Also using the bidirectional routers to then sequence that.
Exactly. Yeah. So we haven't actually got to the bidirectional routers, but has anyone used a switch before?
Yeah.
So these are a bit different to most switches that are on the market now, because you can generally choose the number of stages. Sometimes you have kind of random directions and things like that. But if I were to just kind of take this back to just, where do we? Oh no, I've lost myself in a second. So this oscillator here is doing a really subtractive thing. Instead of just doing, here we go. Right. Instead of just having the same sequence over and over, then you could use a bidirectional router. So I could take its output, put it into an input here, take the second row output, put it into another input, and then, so this is the bidirectional quad switch. And then I might just divvy up something completely different. This positive slew here into this input, right? So now I'll take the switch's output, and what I'm going to need to do is every third stage, I'm going to change which CV source is actually going to the oscillator. Right? So I go into here, and I take its output, and now I put it into the actual slow that down a bit. So for each step, you're getting a different CV source. Yeah. Sorry, every third step. I might just do it every step just now because it's slow. Going to a different one. So I mean, so many different ways that you can use this stuff.
Sorry, you're switching between mode on the sequencer with the...
That's exactly right. Yeah. So what I've got is I had an 8-step sequence, just because, and then each one of these outputs I'm going to this quad switch, and the input to it is every clock pulse. So that means on every clock pulse, it's going to shift through 1, 2, 3, 4 that goes back to the to the oscillator, which means that you could have, I mean, I'm just taking the sequencer out because we're talking about sequences, but obviously you could have a whole bunch of different interesting sources that on every clock pulse, they go to different places. Yeah. Talking about interesting modulation sources, I'm going to keep this patched up because it takes too long to unpatch things. So I'm going to just bring in another sound source here. So this guy. I want to talk a little bit about the smooth and stepped function generator and what you can do with it. So these are generally thought of as like I'm going to use this one down here because both the smooth and the stepped work. The stepped doesn't work on the one above. Unfortunately, it's got a purple dot. But this is your kind of sample and hold area. The smooth function generator allows you to bring in a CV source and slew it, or cycle it upon itself and then change the rate. So it's another form of slew, but you can do a bunch of things with it. You can also make it an oscillator as well. The stepped function generator is a sample and hold that's a little bit different to a sample and hold that you might be used to, and I'll show you why in a second. Because it also has a rate, but you're also sampling things, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take the stepped function generator and I'm going to cycle it upon itself. So this is going to create a triangle waveform. So you take its cycle here and its input, and you move them back on itself. And then I take its stepped output, which is on the bottom, and I'm going to go into my... Alright, tune that up. Okay. So you would think that because I've got a rate control and I'm cycling it on itself, that now we should be creating kind of random pitches or sampled and held pitches. But you actually also need a sample input as well, right? So I'm going to go into test your memory here. I'm going to go into this dual processor here because I'd like to take out an interesting sample and hold source. Remember that kind of digital noise that we heard earlier? I'm going to use that as my input. Is that what I'm doing? Actually, I'm not going to cycle it on itself. No, I'll come back to that. All right, I will cycle on itself, and we'll do this in just a second. Okay, cool. So now what I need something to give me timing. So this one up here. Okay. It's cycling it by itself, and I sample the input. Okay. So when you cycle it upon itself, you actually get a triangle waveform. But because this, can you hear these little patterns coming? Because this has got a rate control, that cycling is happening periodically, but it's happening much, much faster than the sample source. So we start to get these kind of really interesting patterns that appear. As I slow it down, you'll start to actually hear the sound of that triangle waveform sampled. So let's have a listen. as you slow it down further, it takes ages to come back down. Okay, so that's it cycling on itself, but you can then obviously put anything into it, right, as the thing that it's sampling. Yeah. So that when you cycle it upon itself, the internal, you can hear it coming down now. The internal kind of triangle waveform becomes your source. But now let's take, I'm going to do what I was going to do before. So I'm going to take the output of the dual voltage processor, which has got nothing in it at the moment. I'm going to put it into this input here. Okay. And then I'm going to put something into this and scale it, because I want some scaling. I don't want it just to be all over the place. So I'm going to make that faster, turn up the oscillator. So this is my weird sample and hold source. And as I scale it up, so this is with the rate really high, yeah? So although it's not cycling upon itself, the rate is how, it's got an internal slew before you sample it, yeah? Let's increase that. Alright, now I'm going to decrease the rate. Notice the steps get smaller, so then it becomes microtonal. Well, it was already microtonal, but and this, the speed can also be voltage controlled. So I've got this pretty simple, smooth stepped and timing one here. I'm just going to take out the stepped. I'm going to voltage control the speed of this stepped generator. So then you go from really slow kind of microtonal things to crazy stuff pretty fast. Now it sounds like someone doing Flight of the Bumblebee with their violin detuned. Cool. So that's that process. How long do you think we should keep going for? I've just been yapping on forever. So what time is it?
The time is, it's getting close to 8 now.
Okay.
It's yeah, like 10 to 8. So
Okay.
it's up to you. How much
Alright.
have you got? Much more you'd like
I
to?
just wanted to show square waves, and that's about it. Yeah.
I'd like to hear square waves.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I'll show you square waves, and then maybe kind of phasing that and going into the triple wave shaper as well. All right. So maybe another 5-10. So there's no dedicated square wave output in the Serge, but you can make one. There's multiple things that can make one. So if you think about the envelope generator, for instance, if you cycle an envelope generator on itself, cycle end, it's not only creating the envelope shape that I've given it with the attack and release, but it's also got a pulse output, right? So that means you've immediately got a square wave. So what this means is that the attack and release now changes our frequency. But what's really nice about the envelope generator is it's got a changeable pulse width, right? Because it's got this thing called window size. The pulse output that comes out can be controlled by a thing called window size. And then basically what you've got is you've got a change in pulse width, which is changing how much of the high voltage is in relation to the bottom voltage, right? I'm saying really.
Just to clarify, there's no pot for that, is there? It's just a.
Yes, there is. There is
a
a pot for it. So if we do. And it goes where you would expect it to do. It's so now I'm going to voltage control that using another envelope generator. So cycle end, and I'm going to do it slowly. So you can see its speed here. I'd like to attenuate that because it's probably too much voltage that's going to go in. So it's going to go from, you know, one pulse width to absolutely nothing. So let's take this output here, and then we're going to go to the window size. Okay, so as I increase this, which is another dual processor. So this is the source that's doing the pulse width modulation. Square wave sound out of an envelope generator. Another way to make a square wave, so you've got this little module down here, tucked away. It's called a comparator. So it accepts a sawtooth wave in, or a ramp wave in, and then you have this pulse width control as well. So if I were to take a sawtooth, one of the oscillators we've already been using, for instance, this one, and then take the comparator's output, which is actually the pulse, right? Because it is a square wave, and place this into an input. Have I got enough room? What was that? Is that something on my computer? Okay, I'm gonna. Oops. So there it is. Okay, here's the. So this is a sawtooth wave from a normal oscillator, going into the comparator, and then so then you could I can then CV that, right? Couple of different ways to achieve the same thing. Yeah. So if you run out of envelope generators for your envelopes or for making other square waves, then the comparator is your friend. It's got three actually, three different ones. And then obviously if you're talking sub audio rate, then you might be inputting a really low frequency into it, and then you can create interesting rhythms by changing the pulse width as well. So that's one way to look at this. Last thing that I'll talk about is just these two processing modules over here. I'll be quite quick. I'm not going to do any feedback. Just going to take out an oscillator here. I'm going to put it into the triple wave shaper. And I'm going to take the end of the, well, I'll take the first one out of the triple wave shaper. Turn up its volume. Triple wave shaper, again, as I said, there's three identical wave shapers in it. You've just got a wave shaping pot, which also turns its gain as well, so it turns everything off. Okay, so the first one, fine. If I were to make this a sawtooth wave, for instance, things get interesting is when you start to take the output of one into another, right? So you can get some quite interesting tones out of that. So I've got control over the wave shape here and here. Oh, hang on, I did the wrong thing. Did I do the wrong thing? I did do the wrong thing. So you can keep one down and then vary the other one. And if you want to take that one step further, you could take, the output could be the final stage. So you've got your output of the second one going into the third one. So first one goes into the second, second goes into the third, and then I'm monitoring the third output. And then it gets really nice. These are all C beatable. So plenty of different variety there with that one. And then lastly, the phaser. So the phaser has, okay. So the phaser has one input, one audio input, a voltage controlled input, and it's also got 3 independent outputs for different phases. So you've got 360 degrees, 720, and 1080. But then you've got a mix here, which allows you to mix between the original input and the phased input, which is where a phaser is most interesting, I feel. So let's take the square wave from our envelope generator into the phaser, if it will reach. It won't. So I will daisy chain, which is what I've been doing all week. There we go. Into the input of the phaser. And my output of the phaser, I'm going to take the mix. Standard square wave. Okay. So let's put a bit of mix. So what we're doing is we're phase shifting copies of the original with itself. And if I can remember the routing correctly, one thing that I find is that with a phaser, if you take the output and then you send its output back into the input a little bit, you get a more pronounced phasing effect. So it's like the Q, the resonance of a filter. It's basically kind of being fed back into itself to raise the Q. So same thing with the phaser, right? So if I were to take the output, I'm going to need to come out of a mixer because I want, no, that's wrong. No, that's wrong. Sorry, the input, which is coming from my square wave, I'm going to put in a mixer. All right, so the mixer goes to the input of the phaser. And I'm going to raise the level. So, okay. And then I'm going to take the output of the phaser and go into the same mixer. All right. So I'm going to increase that.